People who quit their jobs on the first day. What was your "I'm outta here" moment? Story 1. I had a job for one day selling home security equipment door to door. The whole idea was basically to make it seem like you're doing them a service and then lock the customer into 5-year contracts. My supervisor and I were in this one home of a family that hardly some English. The father said they had been struggling with finances, but my supervisor kept pushing it on them, and the customer seemed like he didn't fully understand what was going on. I couldn't in good conscience take these people that were already struggling and put them in a worse position. Story 2. I was hired as a cook in a country club in Miami, Florida back in 2002. It was the grossest kitchen I have worked in the US. I have been through worse in the US and around the world. Most of the food in the coolers was rotting, there were ants on the cutting board they had me work at. The guy training me picked up a towel off of the floor to push the ants out of the way so I could work. Many of the food that should have been refrigerated was left out. The walk-in freezer door would not close because there was so much ice build up. I felt like I was going to vomit the whole time I was there. I made it through the day, then did not come back for my second day. The chef called me and I told him that I would not come back. He threatened to call the culinary school I went to and tell them I walked out on him. I told him that was fine and called the health department and reported their practices. They called me a year later to follow on the claim and had time to go check it out. I stand by my choice to quit with no notice and reporting them. Story 3. When I was 20, I worked at Wendy's. As fast food jobs go, it wasn't bad. But I wanted to pick up some extra cash, so I decided to add a second job. I had washed dishes in a busy restaurant my senior year in high school, so I figured I could do that. I applied for a dishwasher job at a local IHOP, and I was hired. My first night, I had a shift that was supposed to last until 3 a.m. I knew that was pushing it, because I was scheduled to clock in at Wendy's at 9 a.m. But I figured I could slam a few hours of sleep, and I'd be fine. 3 a.m. came and went, and the guy who was supposed to relieve me never showed up. I ended up working until 6 o'clock. By that time, there was no point in even going to bed, so I just chilled for a few hours at home and went to Wendy's to start my shift. I was lucky I didn't fall asleep behind the wheel on my way there and home. Later that evening, after I got some sleep, I drove down to IHOP and told them I quit. I decided it was better to stay alive than to make some extra money, and so far that decision has proven to be correct. Story 4. I showed up and was 15 minutes into orientation and paperwork. The regional corporate came in and sacked everyone. The regional came up to me and said, "This never happens, we'd love for you to stay." 2 hours later, the regional has to leave for another location. The trainee from another branch that had come to run the branch I was at says, they are about to sack everyone there too. I was like, okay, this isn't for me at all, and left. The regional called me the next day and asked me to reconsider. I thanked them for the courtesy, but nope. When a company shows you who they are, believe them. Story 5. First day at Burger King, I had to clean the men's bathroom. I go in there and there was poop everywhere, next to the toilet, on the ceiling, the walls, and even the sink. I quickly walked out the bathroom, didn't even clock out, and just left the store and went home. I wasn't going to clean that, it was awful. Story 6. I met a landscaping crew at a 50-acre cemetery at 8 a.m. The pay was just $5 per hour cash in 2001, but my hours at Pizza Hut had been cut, and I wanted to make a little money before going off to college. After 3 hours straight of weeding, I couldn't feel my hands. I was filthy and hot AF, it was miserable. I was 18 and headed to a prestigious school in 2 months. The juice wasn't worth the squeeze, as they say. At lunch I told the guy, "Hey man, I'm just gonna go home and I'm not coming back." And he had a totally awesome response, "No problem, I wouldn't want to do this shiz at your age either, I'll pay you for the time you worked and drop it off at your house." $20 showed up about a week later. I hope life is going good, Mr. Sturley. Story 7. I had a week-long labor job. I was told I would be carrying decking lumber up a few stairs. What they didn't say was that the lumber was 6x6 treated lumber, so each load we were carrying was 150 pounds. And those couple of steps were 88 up from a lakeside property. I managed to survive 8 hours, but there was no way possible I could carry a few more tons of lumber up those stairs. I had to go to physio after to fix my knees. Story 8. Coles. First off, they messed up the hiring pretty bad. A group of us spent an entire day trying to do the paperwork and whatnot. It was a hot mess and a huge red flag. But hey, I had been out of a job for 7 months, I needed this. First official day, I'm spending the first half of my shift doing training videos. The amount of dread I felt from the videos constantly emphasizing how you must push the store credit card or you're fired made me uneasy. I mentally checked out when they went over how you'll be fired if you don't have so many sign-ups in a month. I wanted to run, but I really needed the money. I thought I'd transfer out of cashier ASAP and be fine. After lunch, I did register training. It was a stupid slow day and I was expected to constantly be doing something, so I was bored out of my freaking mind. My trainer clocked out an hour into my training and I was pretty much left on my own with someone maybe walking by every now and again to check in. After my shift, I tried to talk to the manager about my possibilities. I had gotten another job offer and wanted to see if I could work a schedule out with both, but the manager wasn't there. I later got an angry voicemail ranting about how I wasn't allowed to work another job unless they worked around their 39.5-hour schedule, and I certainly couldn't do nights for the other company, despite being scheduled all mornings that week, and how dare I be so bold to even bring up this subject. I dropped an immediate resignation notice on her desk the next day and left. Story 9. Told me on day 1 I'd be making $10 an hour instead of $13. Only one other employee working there and he was about 40 to 50. He said hi, then asked if he could get $5 for a pack of cigarettes. Then, I was told I would be making deliveries with my own car when I was working the kitchen and I'd have to work open-close every day. I was openly told I'd have no chance of a raise because the store didn't make enough money. Boss lady turned around and I noped right out of there faster than a pig in a slaughterhouse. Story 10. I got an entry-level job as an arborist at a local tree management service. I was early 20s, fresh out of college, loved trees. So I was pumped to learn more about trees and learn how to trim, cut them down, etc. My first day I was put on a crew with 2 other dudes who were supposed to be my trainers. These 2 were pretty much knuckleheads. We only had the front seat of our truck to sit in as we drove to the jobs, and I had to sit in between the both of them. They were laughing and playing jokes and around the whole day. So we get to an orchard where we were supposed to trim a few trees, and it just so happened that in one of the trees is a massive hornet's nest. The lead guy I was with thought it would be funny to vigorously shake the branch that the nest was hanging from. As you can imagine, he was immediately attacked by hornets and started running towards the truck. However, me and the other guy were between the lead guy and the truck, and once we saw the swarm, we bolted. I remember running through the orchard and thinking, this is too bad. I quit. Story 11. Walking into an Alzheimer's assisted living facility and seeing my college philosophy professor, who was an inspiring individual for me and changed how I viewed things, sitting in a chair in the day room, drooling on himself. I checked with the head on duty, and yeah, it was him. I avoided him as much as I could for the whole day, but when leaving, I told him that he inspired me and I probably wouldn't ever see him again. He was far gone and asked about his slippers. I left, sat in my car, had a smoke and cried. I didn't go back and found another job. Story 12. I applied to be a seasonal package handler at UPS years ago. I go in for the orientation thing and I'm immediately put off by the manager, who just seemed really rude to begin with. The other 40 people and I were about 30 minutes into it when someone sneezed and the manager went off. That is the kind of I'm talking about. I stood up before it seemed like she was finished and just said, "Not for me," and I walked out. I was surprised when I got in the car and about half of the remaining people walked out too. Story 13. I used to work at a craft store as a cashier, but quit when I moved. Ended up going back a couple years later to make some extra cash, but this time in the framing department. During the interview they swore up and down I would only ever be a backup cashier because I said I refused to have full cashier shifts. First shift after interview is listed as framing, but I'm put on cash and told that actually most of my shifts would be cash since they'd found someone else for framing. I spent the next 6 hours giving everyone who came to my register 20% off of everything and then never went back. Story 14. My first internship was at a Brazilian teen detention center. It's akin to a prison, but Brazilian law has some distinctions between crimes committed while as an adult or as a teenager. Teens go through socio-educational measures. I was walking through a courtyard with my supervisor when some doctors came running, flailing their arms and screaming, while officers came running from the opposite direction. I get pulled by my supervisor, who just tells me to run back to our office. These teens as young as 12 had escaped their block. A few minutes later, an officer comes knocking on the doors of the offices and yelling for everyone to run outside because a fire had broken out. Some of the teens had set mattresses on fire in their cells. I didn't really know about. My teacher did, she hadn't even been there that day. So I was forced by the university to choose another place to intern at. Story 15. I was 17 and working precast concrete. Refused to use a rusted tissues ladder. Supervisor called me a p***, got up about 7 rungs before his foot went through one. Heard his foot snap as he fell. I called an ambulance and walked to my car in the parking lot. Story 16. Summer job working for a landscape architect. Got to the job site and he asked me to dig a hole in some rocky dirt. I asked for a shovel. He didn't have one. I asked for a hand spade. He didn't have one. He told me to just dig the hole with my bare hands, and then he drove off to another site, leaving me completely alone. I dug for a little bit and then said, "F this," and left. Had the job specified that I needed to supply my own tools, I could have, but it didn't, and I wasn't going to work for somebody that expected folks to dig through hard, rocky soil with their hands. Story 17. Answered an ad in the paper. This was the mid-90s, what seemed to be an office job, making sales calls when I was in college. Did a phone interview and was called back for an in-person interview. When I go to the interview, I'm led into a room with about 50 other people and a small stage at the front of the room. We're all somewhat confused as to what is going on. Finally, a guy gets on the stage and informs us that we've been selected for the opportunity to sell Cutco. Me and 2/3 of the rest stood up and walked out. Story 18. A long time ago, not long after getting my papers as a chef, I had an interview at a hotel for a position in the kitchen. The executive chef and I chatted in his office for about 20 minutes. At the time, I remember him coming off as very arrogant, which is quite common in this field. I didn't think much of it at the time, as the pay was decent and the shift was what I wanted. As I was leaving his office, I turned to leave through the dining room, the way I had come in, which was closed at the time. It was another hour or so before service started, and he says to me, "No, not that way, go through the kitchen, you're not good enough to go through the dining room." I was so surprised by what he said, I just did what he asked without a word. Later on, after I had got home, I phoned him up and said that after having a close look, I decided that his menu wasn't good enough and that I wouldn't be accepting his offer. Story 19. I got hired at a very small knockoff dollar store in an old, failing mall. The owner was foreign with a very thick accent. He told me I'd get $6 an hour but neglected to mention it was under the table. I spent about an hour stocking the very overly cluttered shelves before I was told to get more chips out of the back storage area. I walk back there and there's about a dozen men sitting on boxes, all crammed into a small back room. I asked where the chips were and these guys all glared at me. They started speaking in another language and rapidly motioned towards me. Then one guy got up and asked what I needed. I told him I was supposed to get a box of chips, and he got a box out of the pile and handed it to me. The entire time these guys are all staring at me. Everything back there looked shady as hell and it was very uncomfortable. A while later I had to use the restroom, which was also in the back. These guys all just wordlessly glared at me while I went into the women's restroom. While I was in the restroom, someone tried to open the door. I was the only woman there. The owner told me he wanted me to come back that night late in the evening, well after the mall closed. I didn't show up. I came in the next morning and lied about why I couldn't work there. He still gave me the few bucks from what little time I did work. I don't know what in the hell that guy had going on there, and I didn't want to find out. Story 20. On the first day of working at Amazon warehouse, the managers broke down to everyone how a 15-minute break works there. Walking to the break room is 2.5 minutes. 10 minutes of actual break and then 2.5 minutes to go back to your stations. It took me 2.5 minutes to walk to my car, and I took a forever break. Story 21. Restaurant line chef. Worked a 12-hour shift, was given 2 breaks of about 10 to 15 minutes each. Burned my hand numerous times because they gave me plates that came right from the oven and never said a word. End of the shift, I told the head chef I was done. He called me soft and said I was the third person to quit on him after a day. I said, maybe it's the way you treat people. Story 22. I answered an ad for a babysitting job. I was already working on a casual basis, but it was sporadic, so I thought some after-hours babysitting would be welcome extra cash. The couple were both in the military and proceeded to tell me that I would be staying in the spare room and looking after their 6-month-old child around the clock as well as doing the housework. I would have 1 day off every 2 weeks. They said it is cash in hand, so I could sign on to the dole unemployment benefit to make up the rest of the money. I left on the spot. They wanted a live-in housemaid and nanny, not a babysitter, and they were not able to pay for one. Why they thought it was up to me to illegally collect the dole to subsidize them, I don't know. If you've gotten this far and enjoying the content, please leave a comment of your own story. We'd love to make a video of them in the future. Story 23. Applied for a job at my longtime favorite restaurant, celebrated my birthday there every year. Owner asked me to come in for basically a tryout, as I communicated I was looking at other job possibilities. I come in and they just stick me on dishwashing for an hour, no biggie. Then their dishwasher doesn't show up, so the kitchen manager asks me to stay for their lunch rush, says I'll get paid for the hours, so I did. Kitchen staff was nice, so I was happy to help out even though I figured I'd be taking a different job. I fill out a time card at the end of the shift and tell the manager I probably wouldn't be back. He understands and thanks me for the help. Fast forward a couple weeks and he tells me to email the owner after I asked him if I should pick up my measly paycheck. I do. She basically tells me to F off over text. Tells me it was a staging and that she told me I wouldn't be paid. I respond that I understand that, but that I stayed an extra 3 hours which I was told I'd be paid for. She stops responding. I decide I want to be petty over the $40, so I get the state labor department involved. Dude goes in there and makes her pay me for the hours including the first staging hour. Couple weeks later I got my $40, never went back to that restaurant. Story 24. My very first job was at a little drive-in restaurant close to my high school. I showed up to work the first day. The lady said I had to pay her $50 for training. She showed me around the place and said that my pay would be $4.50 per hour as a car hop, and all the tips I made went into a bucket with all the other girls' tips. At the end of the night, she counted up tips, kept 20% for herself and split the rest up evenly among every employee. Also, part of our job was 1 day a week we had to spend 4 hours cleaning her house. It seemed super shady. Story 25. I was a waitress, the only waitress at a just opened diner. The boss didn't have me sign any paperwork. Everything was under the table. But that wasn't what made me quit at the end of the night. In order to get me where he wanted me to go, he would pinch my skirt at my upper thigh, not quite the butt but very close, and pull me around like it was a leash. Needed me in the kitchen. Rather than call me, he would come out, pinch my skirt and pull to the kitchen. Needed me at the cash machine. Again, come over to wherever I was, didn't matter if I was serving a customer, and would grab my skirt to pull me. That act in itself made some customers uncomfortable. Mind you, one couple left an almost 50% tip in the end. But I think it was more out of pity and embarrassment on my behalf. I was supposed to come in the next day, but I called that night and said the job wasn't for me. I came in a couple days later to turn in my apron and he just took a wad of cash out of his pocket and paid me then and there. God, he was creepy. I think it was a smart move to quit. Story 26. Had an orientation for an alarm company. Next day, manager calls and says don't worry about going into the office and to meet at Planet Hollywood. They like to get to know the employees better over lunch. Next day, I go into the office and another employee whom I had not met says, "You must be Scandal 929. I was like, huh? They responded, light-skinned, pretty boy is how the manager described me. In same conversation I found out no one else had ever been invited for a get-to-know-you lunch. I'm out. Story 27. I was hired to be a waitress, which has a lower hourly wage due to tips. The entire shift they had me wash dishes in the sink, but paid me waitress wages. A few months later the restaurant was investigated for a number of fraud activities. Story 28. It was a small independent insurance agency in 2006. My first day there, the owner, a true fossil, said email and fax were strictly forbidden as he only believed in communication in person. by phone or through mail. Left for lunch and never went back. I couldn't imagine the inefficiency I'd have dealt with had I stayed. They ultimately closed their doors, so it was definitely the right decision. Story 29. I interviewed for a professional marketing assistant and got the job straight away. I was under the impression that I would be an assistant to the man I was interviewed by. When I showed up for my first day, the same waiting room I was in the previous day was full of people. I quickly learned that we were all hired and that I would be a door-to-door salesperson selling some pretty useless shiz. I spent my entire day inside a Starbucks applying for other jobs and went home, got paid, but never went back. Story 30. I got a job at a Build-A-Bear knockoff at the end of a mall that wasn't very busy. My interview with the owners was interesting. They were an older couple who said that they had wanted to open a Chick-fil-A, but you need about $1 million to do that. My first day, one other girl was working and she didn't really talk to me. I had basically no training and she disappeared into the back. I was standing at the register area, which was underneath a giant storybook mushroom. A mother and her young son walk in and start to look at the bearskin options. I greeted them and left them to look around. They ended up leaving after a couple minutes and my coworker reappeared from the back with the cordless phone and handed it to me. It was my boss. He told me that when a customer walks in, he wants me to come out from under the mushroom to them. After he finished speaking to me, I hung up and went to my coworker and asked about the phone call. She said the place has cameras set up and the owners watch them from their house and call in a lot. I did not come back to work after that day. Story 31. Young and naive right out of college took a marketing job. My interview was great, nothing shady seemed to be going on and no immediate red flags. After 4 hours of training, my first day consisted of going door to door in a suburban town trying to sell cable to older people. We were told to dress for business, so I'm hiking around for miles in my best skirt, suit jacket and heels. Hours were from 9 to 5, but we didn't get back to the business until well after 10 p.m. Not to mention, the person I was shadowing was able to make a sale to an older gentleman who seemed to have memory issues. I noped the F right out of there. Story 32. My very first job was at a buffet restaurant that was popular with senior citizens and known for their desserts. I was asked to get another coconut cream pie from the back, and as I was getting it out of the fridge, another employee bumped into me and I dropped it on the floor, pie side down. This employee's solution was to just scrape off all the whipped topping and replace it. I was horrified. They served pie that had been on the extremely dirty floor and never went back. Story 33. They hired me to work full-time. I had interviewed to work full-time. I was trying to quit a horrible job, and this job was on the other end of town. I needed enough money for the bus pass and to make up the difference and more of quitting my old job. They hired me and showed me my schedule. I showed up for my first day, things are going good. Then my manager called me in, sat me down, and explained that they'd have to cut me down to 15 hours a week because they'd hired too many effing people. I explained, painfully, that I had to take a bus an hour each way and wouldn't be able to pay rent or food after that. He said I could always hold out and hope people quit. I told him he could start with me, took off my apron and stormed out in tears. Story 34. Motel gig in Raleigh, North Carolina when I was young and desperate for a job. Any job. Came in to relieve the cigarette hag overnight lady who told me about the bat she kept beneath the counter, which rooms had the prostitutes and which rooms were for the genuinely lost tourists, and not to give out towels to certain people because they had 10 plus people to a room and they were trying to get them to leave. While she was talking to me, one of the prostitutes came up and paid her with sweaty boob money. Also, they expected me to do laundry in the back room in between babysitting the front desk. Also, to watch out for stray needles or paraphernalia in the sheets. I overheard a man in the lobby on the phone talking about how he had a friend who was in jail and he was going to hire him to kill his cousin who was in that same jail. All in between bites of bargain bin Fruit Loops from the continental breakfast. I left. They never sent me my check for working that day and I never called to get it. Story 35. Fast food chain. I was 17. I found out during training that the place had been robbed 3 times in the past month and one employee was seriously injured. Not worth the $5 per hour. Story 36. Salesman for Kirby Vacuums. First sale call was to a single elderly woman who was supporting her son in hospital. They got us in the door by offering a free carpet clean as a demonstration. The supervisor training me pushed and pushed to make the sale until this old woman was in tears. Just as she was about to sign the paperwork, I asked if she actually wanted the vacuum, and she said it was lovely but she couldn't afford it. I took the paperwork away from her and said not to worry. Outside, I told the supervisor I quit, to which he replied, I would have been fired anyway. No love lost. I hung around for half an hour playing on my phone to make sure the supervisor left because he was a real piece of work. Story 37. One of my first jobs was as a cook at Chuck's. I enjoyed it and the guys I worked with were cool. One day the chick who normally played Chucky called in sick, probably from the costume, and they tapped me as the new cook to be in the suit. It's everything you think it is. Giant effing head you can't see out of, sitting on a construction helmet that smells of stale body odor and late-night alcoholic binges. The suit was musty and had a slight slickness to the inside. Chucky only has 3 fingers, so you're wearing these gloves that force you to do the Vulcan salute all day. And then there's the kids. Kids love hitting Chucky. Especially in the junk. After the shift, they said I did a great job, really handled it like a pro, offering me a 50-cent an hour pay raise in the full-time gig. I made myself a pizza, grabbed one of the 500 ticket keychains and bounced. That was a solid no from me. Still got the keychain somewhere. As bad as it was one of my dad's favorite stories to tell about me when we met people. He had a true gift for spinning a tale, and even though he died in 2017, and even though the job and the experience was awful, I can still hear him gleefully telling the story, and it makes me smile. So in a way, I can never really hate on Chuck E. Cheese, because it reminds me a lot of my dad. I'd go through 100 more terrible jobs just to hear him retell the experiences again. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button and subscribe to Thread Talk for more content like this. Also, don't forget to turn on notifications so you never miss out. Have a dope day and we'll see you in the next video. Cheers!